What are the purpose of resources in a TTRPG? Are they simply there to restrict players and force them into downtime to take a break or rest? Or are they something that we as game designers can use as a tool to interact with decision making during combat or even outside of combat? Hello, Supers. I'm Zarek Odinsky, the lead designer of Indominant, a brand new superhero TTRPG. And today I want to talk about resources, what different types of resource systems there are, and what purpose they serve in a game. So, with that, let's jump right in. Wait, I'm sensing something. My psionic powers have activated, and I'm sensing that you're pressing the like button right now. In all seriousness, please like the video and comment down below what your thoughts are, and then also subscribe to our YouTube channel so that you can keep up to date and see all of our updates and our interesting game design topics. I do also want to mention that we have a Backerkit campaign that's launching on April 8th for the first of our 3 core rulebooks. This is the Super's Information Codex, which is the book that has all of the player-focused content, as well as all of the rules to play the game. We also already have our game system primer out. You can go to DTRPG to purchase a physical copy, or if you subscribe to our newsletter or join our Discord server, you can also get your free PDF of the game system primer, which has levels 1 through 5 with all the core rules for both the player and the comic editor, which is what we call the Game Master in Indominant. All of those links are in the description down below and in the pinned comment. So with that said, for today's topic, we're going to be talking about resources, as I mentioned, and I want to propose that they are more than just a restriction or limiter on power for characters. I think they can be used as a tool to make decision making both inside and out of combat more interesting and involved. Before I get into how that interacts with the decision making process, let's just take a look at a few different systems that are out there and are common, and then we'll talk about the pros and cons, and then we will get to the bulk of my proposition. I do want to have a disclaimer since last video I didn't make it clear, but these are not my personal opinions as far as the pros and cons of these systems, but they're more the general points made by the community about these systems. I try to keep my personal views out of these kinds of pros and cons just because I'm trying to be objective, and I use the general points and opinions of the community, kind of the consensus, to come up with these pros and cons. The first resource system that we're going to talk about is one that's very common in a very popular game, D&D 5e, that I'm sure most of us know, and that is what I call a resource bucket system. You might know it as Vancian or Vancian-like, but a resource bucket system is one where you've got multiple different resources, maybe for each feature or ability you have, and when you use one, you tick off a use, and each one is isolated from each other. Usually, a very common one that this is used in is for spell casting in fantasy RPGs. And so you'll have different spell slots at different levels. Those levels will kind of determine the power. Level 1 is low power, and as you go up to level 9, it gets higher, or whatever level that system uses. Each of those sets of spell slots, or buckets, when you use that one, you just use like a level 1 spell. You don't have any effect on your level 6 or 7 spells. Some different subtypes are what's called prepared or memorized spell casting, more of the classic Vancian. This is where you predetermine the spells at each level or bucket that you have each day, and then as you use them, you forget or cannot use that spell at that specific level again until each of your slots is gone. And then there's more of a spells known type of system, which is where maybe 20 different spells, and then you have a certain amount of slots at each spell level, and you can spend those slots on whatever spell as long as that spell can be cast at that level. So the pros of this is that it can be a lot easier to track since you're just marking off uses. You don't have to do any math because you're not using multiple spell levels generally. You're only going to be using one spell level at a time, and it's just a bit easier to track when you can just mark something off rather than doing some addition or subtraction. This also makes decision making easier because you don't have to consider all of your other resources when you're using one. So if I use one of my level 1 spell slots in D&D, I don't have to consider how that affects my ability to use a level 3 or level 5 spell slot, for example. Just how many level 1 spell slots I have. And so this can make it a lot easier to make decisions. You don't have many things to consider, you just have that little bucket to consider. Some of the cons is that once you get too many buckets, even though you've compartmentalized the tracking and understanding of each bucket, once you have a certain amount of buckets, it can start to get overwhelming, bloated, and cumbersome to track. For example, if I've got like 12 different buckets that I have to track separately, it can be kind of cumbersome. It can lend itself to a hoarding mentality. Not that this is the only system that has that, but you can run into a feeling where you save all of your highest and most powerful resources for the perfect scenario. You know, we're going to fight a dragon, so let's save all of our high-level spell slots no matter what, just in case we run into a dragon. And so then you're just using your weak resources, and you know, it resorts in, like I said, that hoarding mentality. And lastly, it can flatten some of the decision making for, you know, tactical decisions and even expressive decisions. I don't have to consider how using my level 1 spells will affect the way I can use my action surge or my second wind if I'm a fighter, or how it could affect my higher level spells. I just have to consider the effects of that one resource. And so it can really just flatten that decision making. Do I have this many spell slots of this level? Is this bucket still have some water in it? Then I can spare some water. The second resource system that I want to talk about is what I'll call a shared resource pool, or just a resource pool. It's something that's really common in a lot of video games like MMORPGs or JRPGs. Usually it's called a mana system or mana points. In this type of resource system, you have one big shared pool that you have to spend some out of for most or all of your different powers and abilities. For example, in Indominant with Drive, you may have at level 5, 10 drive, and then you have tier 1 through 3 powers that spend 1, 2, or 3 drive. And so when you use a tier 3 power, it'll affect how many tier 1 powers you can use afterwards. Usually these kinds of systems have larger numbers where you might be doing a decent amount of math, you know, especially if you think of games like MMORPGs, you might have hundreds or thousands of mana, and you're going to be spending large chunks at a time. But generally in TTRPGs, the numbers are pretty small. You might get up to around 20 or something like that as your maximum, and you might spend anywhere from 1 to 7 or 8. We do use this sort of system in Indominant with our drive resource for powers, and we do supplement this with a few different buckets like your archetype abilities. Some of those have a per encounter use limit, and some have a per day or per rest limit. And then some inherent effects and some talents also have their own restricted uses. So we do use a bit of both systems, but primarily we use a resource pool system. The pros of a system like this is that you have to make decisions tactically. You have to consider how those decisions affect your ability to use other powers. Some systems might have ways to limit this, but in general, you do have to consider how one choice can affect your other choices in the future. Generally, the tracking is more difficult because you're working with a larger number and you're doing addition and subtraction, but the benefit is that it's a pretty flat difficulty curve. Once you're used to tracking a resource pool, whether your pool is 5 or 20, it doesn't make a very big difference usually. And so throughout your career as a character, the tracking of your resources is not going to get much harder than it started. Some cons is that it can be harder to track. Like I said, you're doing addition and subtraction of a larger number rather than marking off one use out of each of your buckets. And in some systems, you might even have to do addition as well as the subtraction, where instead of just considering how much you're spending, you may be regaining some of that resource as well. And so the tracking can get cumbersome in some ways where you're constantly adding and reducing this number of your resource. So now that we've looked at a few different resource systems, we can talk about how these can be a tool for game designers to interact with and make decision making more interesting and maybe even incentivize different play styles. Any resource system can have this effect. Some just might have a little bit more different ways to do that. Generally, if there's more tactical weight to your decision making, then we also can kind of give you more tools and incentivize different methods of play to have you interact with that resource system. They are not just a source of attrition-based combat where once you're out, that's kind of when the game tells you it's time to go take a break in-game and rest and recover. To give some examples of how we can use this as a tool, we'll look at Indominant. And so one of the main ways we interact with the drive system, which is our resource pool, is that every archetype has a unique way, we call it their drive recovery feature, to regain or mitigate how much drive they use. So for example, the Arbiter archetype, they can reduce how much drive they spend once per turn. And so this allows them to use a higher tier power and have it cost less or even no drive. And then also, as you get higher level, it lets you use some of your lower tier powers for free. This does mean that an Arbiter won't last as long because they can never recover any drive. And so Arbiters have to consider their long-term power. They have the ability to heal, and so that's kind of why they have that restriction. But it makes them approach the game differently than, say, a Bruiser, who whenever they hit an enemy with a melee attack or whenever they are hit with an effect, they regain some drive. So they could spend some turns not using drive, using just their base powers or their archetype abilities, while they recover enough drive to use a higher tier power, maybe like a tier 6 power at higher levels. And so with the Bruiser, that incentivizes them to get into the mix and trade blows with their enemies and play sort of like a barbarian where they're not too worried about their well-being. And then we have the Blaster archetype. They start with low drive in combat and they start ramping up how much drive they have every round. They recover a lot of drive on the second and following rounds of combat. And so this means that they have to sort of be safe in the way they play at the beginning of a fight because they can't just go guns blazing out the gates. And as you can see with these different types of interactions and ways that we can have players interact with the game, it also means that teamwork is really important. The Arbiter, they have to consider how they use their drive. They can go all out right away, but they have to consider how they will be able to maintain their power as the combat goes on and as their allies take damage. So they have to consider how they're going to be able to continue to heal their allies. Versus the Blaster, they can't go guns blazing at the start of a fight, and so they have to play safe and let their teammates protect them and stand in front of them while they kind of build up their drive and start being able to deal out a lot of damage. And then you have like Bruisers and Guardians. They're more of the tank kind of characters. They are meant to go out and interact with the enemy and try to get them to attack them and help out their allies in certain ways. And so it means that every character kind of has a role in a way that they can play the game that's different from other characters. So thank you for joining me today. Make sure to like the video and subscribe, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this topic down below, and we will see you next time.
Thank you.